Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm an Airbus A330 pilot, and on a lot of my recent videos I was asked by people, so why do you select config 3 for your landings? Why don't you use config 4? In today's video we will answer that very question. Now, in order to understand the basics, let's quickly talk about why we have different landing flap settings available in the first place. Next, we are then going to talk about the differences in the technique that we have to use on the approach. But let's start with the basics. Why do we have different landing flap settings? Now, config full obviously provides us with the greatest amount of lift at the slowest speed, therefore minimizing our landing distance required. However, in many cases you don't really need that at all. In many cases your runway is more than long enough and you can fly that little bit faster. But how big is the difference between the two flap settings? Well, let's have a look at the real-world Airbus performance calculator on an example of the approach that we're about to fly right now. And this is what it looks like. So, on the left-hand side I have done a calculation in automatic mode, and the Airbus tool advised us to use config full, which gives us an approach speed of 131 knots and a factored landing distance required of 2092 meters. On the right hand side I've manually forced it to config 3, and you can see that the approach speed is 3 knots higher at 134 knots and the factored landing distance required is 2206 meters. So the difference between the two is 3 knots of speed and approximately just over 100 meters of runway. Now, what would be reasons to use config 3 then, and what would be reasons to use config full? Well, the primary reason, of course, is fuel. So, using config 3 saves you approximately 40 to 50 kilos of fuel on the approach. While that may not sound like a lot, if you calculate it all the way up to the entire fleet of around 100,000 aircraft flying, then you end up with huge savings for the environment every day. And any saving for the environment coincidentally also is a saving for the airline, and therefore is attractive to them. Now, looking into the next question, what is the difference between the approach techniques then? Now, for that we need to consider when to use each of those settings. Obviously config 3 is our favorite setting because it saves the most money if we have good weather conditions. However, that's already where things stop. So the A330, just like for example the A319, is very hard to slow down on approach. And this means that if you've got forecast tailwind on the arrival, you would almost always go for config full because you want that extra drag to slow the aircraft down. You want to have that drag. Now, other examples would be during turbulent conditions. Many pilots will tell you that the A330 feels more stable when you are using config full, and therefore the effect of the turbulence becomes a little bit less. Now, personally, I'm not 100% convinced of that argument just yet, but there's gotta be something to it if so many people say it, right? In any case, if you are using config full, you will need a slightly higher thrust on the approach, which means that you have more margins to play with. You can make larger changes if they become absolutely required. Now, last but not least, let's talk about the landing technique. Basically, on the A330-200, the one that we are flying right now, it's not really all that different. So on the A330-200, you are not in risk of any tail strikes or anything the likes. Therefore, your aircraft will easily be flown down with around 2 degrees more pitch, but that's pretty much it. On the A330-300, tail strike is a little bit more of a topic, but it's still not as critical as, for example, the Boeing 737. To give you an idea, on the A330-300, using a config full approach, you have around a meter tail clearance, and config 3 reduces that by some 30 to 50 centimeters. On a 737, 50 centimeters tail clearance is the best case scenario that you can achieve, and it will go even lower. So the A330 is really not a tail strike critical aircraft, and therefore that is not really an argument, unless wind shear conditions are expected, in which case tail strike becomes a little bit more of an issue. But overall, you can see how config 3 comes with the advantage of saving around 50 kilos of fuel, which equals the CO2 of your private car driving from Frankfurt to Berlin. While it doesn't really bring any major disadvantage unless you're operating in tailwind conditions. Well, that much about config 3 and config full on your approach. I do hope you enjoyed this one. I do hope you enjoyed these little graphics from the actual Airbus performance tool, showing you exactly what the differences are. Thank you very much for watching. As always, be sure to leave a like, comment to let me know your opinion, and subscribe if you're up for more tutorials like this one. And if you really love what I'm doing on the channel, I would appreciate a small donation using the Buy Me Coffee link in the video description below. Thank you for watching, and I'm looking forward to see you all again on the next one.